All right. All right, so we're streaming. And I'm going to go ahead and click record. Hi, I'm Ashley Nichols. We're podcasting and live streaming over Twitch from Northeast Ohio. This is the Growing Democracy Podcast, a space for citizens, experts, and advocates to create community together. Each week, we invite a guest to talk about civic engagement, governance, and how to grow our democracy. This episode is part of our series on the power of political and civic engagement. We're talking with local elected officials, public officials, and community activists to learn more about what civic and political engagement means to them and how they are involved in their communities. I didn't even mess up. Yeah. 98% me, 100. Yeah. Yeah, I think so. They did. They were like, hey, you know what would be amazing if you all did what you did and then you made it live so that people could see how I mean, they were really nice about it. They were like, they could see behind the scenes and what a podcast actually looks like. I heard it as, and then we could like catch all of those things that you say that you kind of stumble over every single time. So we're here, we're doing it. Yeah, so why are we on Twitch, Casey? That's a Yeah, so Dan is a doctoral student at Kent State University. We know Dan, full disclosure. His current work is concerned with the effects that gaming communities and video games have on political attitudes and behavior. He's a self described lifelong gamer. He joins us from his home in Kent, where he lives with his wife, Mary Kate, and their three cats, Oliver, Cinnamon, and Sam. So happy to have you with us today, Dan. Well, we're also nerds. Maybe our nerdiness is different, but we fully feel that. Um, so it's not happenstance that we're podcasting and live broadcasting on Twitch. I would love for you to talk us through and talk our listeners through your research area. Like, what does it mean to study kind of gaming communities and political attitudes? What does that mean? cinnamon. Oh, you know what? But it worked. Yeah. That's why we did a promo video. Huh. That's a good question. I also have a follow-up when we get back to this. All right. Any insights? Yeah. Why the... I know. I'm getting there. All right. We are figuring out why Dan and Casey... No. I know. I'm speaking out loud while I'm typing. Dan told me to say it's content. It's content. So they just hear me cackling and they have no idea what I'm laughing about. It's awesome. All right. Hold on a second. All right. Navigating two platforms here. Dan is showing off his other cat. All right, I'm going to stop recording on here momentarily. And can you guys talk? No, I can't hear you anymore either.
Oh,
that's
unfortunate. I can hear you now.
Oh. It's like, was that an AT&T commercial? Can you hear me now?
Can you hear me now?
Can you hear me now? Was that AT&T, Sprint, Verizon? I'll just keep naming it.
I think it was Verizon.
So we figured
that was Sprint. Although I think that actor is over with Verizon now.
Oh, okay. I think you're.
I think that's what happened.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah. David says we're good now.
Yeah, I'm getting
our lovely producer, David Yersa. Yeah, our lovely producer, David Yersa, just said you're good now. Thanks, David.
On Twitch too, all things.
No, on Slack, because we have to have all of the technology.
Oh,
yeah,
my
no. He told us on Slack that that they can hear us now.
So on Twitch, we are still live streaming because I figure, hey, why not live stream all the technical difficulties? They can now hear you.
Okay.
And so I'm going to go ahead and record again. Please tell me in the chat if you can't hear once I hit record. It's worked previously, but I had to change my mic system because I'm doing it on multiple systems. So, all right.
Okay.
All right.
All right. We're back.
So I want to ask a real quick follow-up question, Dan, and please, if you don't want to answer, no problem. But
Sure.
Just for our purposes, can you define for us political behavior and political attitudes?
Basically what I mean within this context for political behavior is just kind of, I guess, the low-level stuff. Who does a person vote for? Do they vote? Do they participate in local politics on sort of the smaller, more individual level? Do they donate to campaigns, right? And the other thing being attitudes, with just who specifically are they voting for? What things are they supporting as far as issues on bills go, and etc. It's obviously a little bit more nuanced than that, but that's the real quick and easy of it, if you will.
So my question is, why gaming and democracy, right? Or gaming and political action? Why those two things together? And I know, right, they're your two interests, but why do you see those things as being important to study?
Well, I guess I kind of have two answers to this. The one is a little bit simple in the fact that I believe that this is a cultural space that is kind of up and coming, and it's kind of growing and growing as the years go on. I think statistically, like, most people play video games now, and more people are, as time goes on. And so if something like this is big and important within the lives of individuals, it kind of makes sense that it might be big and important in their political lives. The other sort of side of it is there's a certain individual and personal quality to video games that it's part of why I find them interesting and part of what I enjoy about the games. And there's, at least in my opinion, there's a very human aspect to playing video games that I think is part of why they're enjoyed by people. The social aspects of them is also kind of in the same vein. And in a certain way, I mean, video games are political, and they always kind of have been. And I think that's often kind of hard to hear for a lot of gamers, especially, is that video games are political, because there's a want to not think of video games as political, but they are, because darn near everything is political. So when I see these individuals and watch and listen and play with these people who want to sort of have this escapism of video games, right? That's kind of the way they frame it. They don't want to talk about politics. They don't want to think about politics. And in some ways, I understand that desire of not wanting to have that escapism. But I mean, I guess it sounds a little depressing, but you can't escape it. The messages in these video games, the way you interact with people, the people you interact with as well, is another thing that I am looking at. It affects you, and yeah, that's pretty much, I guess, it.
Well, I appreciate that too, right? Because, right, so if you are in community with people, whatever that might be, and you're interacting with similar content, that's shaping your interactions, that's shaping all sorts of things, right? And so, it's likely has some sort of relationship to how you also see the broader world, and kind of how power is understood and who has it, and so many things. But on that point, I think many folks, I'm learning lately that I am definitely no longer young. And it might have something to do with my middle school age children who are downstairs listening to me and sending me text messages. They're also watching on Twitch. So shout out to Tessa and Ella. But right, so it's often thought that video games are for young people. And that's also paired with this kind of stereotype that young people aren't politically engaged, right? Or they're not they're not interested in politics. What are your thoughts on kind of those, video games are for young people, and, therefore, if that's the assumption, they're probably not very interested in politics.
Yeah, I guess probably my first thought would be, clearly video games, not that you're saying this, but clearly video games aren't just for young people. I think part of that idea and the reason why people think that or might have that assumption is simply because younger individuals they're early adopters, right? They seek out and effectively use the newest technologies arguably better than people who are significantly older than them. And video games are a technology. So you have to have the background, the life experience to effectively utilize them. Like my father is very staunchly against video games. He does not enjoy them even slightly. And growing up, he would always beleaguer himself with the fact that we wanted to play video games, and he was always frustrated by that growing up. But it's because he didn't play video games growing up, right? But me and my brother and my sisters, we did. So nowadays we're more used to it, so we play them more. I think as the years go on and sort of my generation, millennials, become older, you're going to see a lot of gaming be more actively targeted towards an older audience as well. I think that's just going to end up being true within the industry. That's just an assumption that I probably have. But I definitely don't think, there might be some people who would think that maybe part of the reason why young people don't participate in politics or have an interest in politics is because they're interested in this technological world of video games and social media. And I don't necessarily think that's true. But I guess I understand the sentiment, though, especially with how the video game community, at least parts of it, wants to actively portray themselves as apolitical or non-political, and it's very easy to sort of mesh those 2 points together, of video games not being political, and therefore the people playing them don't want to be political. But my sort of contention to that would be, if you look a little deeper and a little under the surface, you can actually find a decent amount of actually active and engaging politics in some of these spaces. Some spaces more than others, definitely. And I would say that there's reasons for that. Maybe I'll get around to talking to those. It's one of my favorite parts of my current theorizing of what I do. But there's a lot of other effects within the community and within the gaming industry as well that sort of have those kind of associations.
Now, I'm curious, and full disclosure, the biggest 2 video games I play are Animal Crossing and Dragon Quest Builder. So I'm not one of those that I'm grinding away every weekend, trying to take on the big boss. So a lot of my experience with video games comes from the fact that I have a spouse and I have a child that both play a lot of video games. Hey, Dharma. Hey, Brandon. And something struck me as very curious, and it struck me as curious when I was watching a few recent video games that my daughter was playing, but it's occurred to me before then, and so I guess I'm curious about the ways in which video games seem to incorporate a lot of really kind of serious discussion about social issues, and especially those that policy and government have failed to act on into this plot. So, for example, just thinking about displays of like government corruption in Persona 5, or how in Yakuza Like a Dragon takes on issues of homelessness, the treatment of immigrants, or sex work. Are these games outliers, or are gamers increasingly drawn to games that actually do tackle issues of social justice?
Yeah, I definitely wouldn't call them outliers, because personally, from my experience as someone who actually is looking for these things, and kind of what I was saying before, video games are often very political. Like they have those political messages already in them, and there's a few reasons for that. For example, just as another one, you look at a game like Wolfenstein, right? Wolfenstein is a game that literally has you fighting Nazis. I don't know what could possibly have more political messaging than that. It's a very political thing. Or just any number of ones that also have instances of like representation for just any and all communities. So to a certain extent, I think there's a very obvious, the very obvious reason of why that is true is because it's a certain connection factor with people. You know, you can't have a good story in anything, whether it be a movie, a television, or a video game, without there being a certain quality of human struggle or conflict, right? And we write and we like to experience things that we know. So when these individuals are writing these games or coming up with stories, maybe they're fantastical in certain expressions, or they're science fiction and they're in the future or wherever have you. But the stories that they have are human because individuals and people like experiencing human stories, because those are the stories that they can connect with and the ones that they can sympathize with. And I think the extension of that idea comes from the video game industry actively recognizing that the stories and the individuals who are playing games are, in a sense, evolving and growing. So with those instances of social justice in video games, and there's plenty more instances within other games, in a sense, I would say that a part of that is the industry just recognizing that these are human, relatable stories and issues that people on some level care about, and they put them in the games because they want people to care about their games, because that makes for a good game, because it makes for a good story. And, you know, the inner capitalist of it is that increases sales. So
yeah, I mean, that makes a lot of sense. One of the things that you just said that kind of struck me was talking about representation, and it reminded me of, there have been several recent events happening at kind of this intersection of gaming and representation, some of which seem to offer a lot of hope, right? While others maybe, I don't know, showcase a more problematic nature of the gaming industry. So it occurred to me, right, thinking of The Last of Us 2, how designers actually incorporated functionality into the game, which would allow sight impaired and blind players to be able to play. To me, I mean, it's mind-boggling that is such a cool thing to think of to do in a video game, and how impactful that must be for folks that really hadn't been able to experience a video game perhaps before. And then on the flip side, you know, and that the thing is, that suggests to me that there's a desire to make gaming more accessible, right? And really inclusive. And then at the flip side, you have this, you know, Gamergate happening that centers on issues of sexism and anti-progressivism in video game culture. So I guess for me, I'm just curious, how do we make sense of these two things happening at the same time?
I think, yeah, I understand what you're talking about, and yeah, that can definitely be maybe a little frustrating or confusing. I know I feel that way at times. I think that the right distinction I would make, at least, is that there is this, I would say, gap or divide between the video game industry and the video game community or gamers. So if you look at video games as an industry, right, it's a very select group of people that are actually contributing, right? It's the producers, the companies themselves, the writers, the programmers, the artists, the voice actors, etc. But that's a very small sort of microcosm of people. And when you look at the individuals who are playing these games, all of the individuals who are playing these games, those individuals are it's a far wider net to cast, if you will. So with those individuals, they are wildly different as far as levels of income go. They are wildly different as far as demographics that they belong to, like socioeconomic status, just a lot of things. And also, I would argue, ideologically speaking, I think the numbers probably hold up on this, that the individuals making games in sort of that Hollywood elite sort of mentality would tend towards liberal and progressive ideologies. And obviously they're going to do those things in their games. The amount of representation within games has just, I mean, it's exploded in like these last 20 years. I think that that's a good thing, and I think that that's worthwhile. But this side of the gaming community has had a reaction to it. I'll call it a reaction. So you have instances like Gamergate, for instance. And I think the important thing with that and sort of the sexism that was sort of on display of the gamer community within those events and other events as well, is that can't be taken as the whole of the gamer community, right? And not that anyone necessarily is, but taking it that way. But there is a section of, I'll call it, of the gaming community that does lean more in sort of a conservative ideology, right? Just like would be true with any, people who are fans of movies or sports or television. That's true. The world works. And at the end of the day, when you have examples of things happening where those individuals get riled up, then they are the ones who are reactionary to it, right? And they're the loudest voices, so they're the ones that get heard. And I think it is a little unfortunate that, there can be so much good that comes out of the gaming community. You look at like numbers for like charity money raised, even here on Twitch, and you get some really impressive, very heart-filling numbers of people just giving lots of money to these worthwhile causes, and just all of these good things like increasing technology within the video game industry for accessibility purposes. There's a lot of good that can come from the game community. And I mean, good things, they don't play as well on the nightly news or whatever you want to call it, right? It's not as fun to listen to, whereas people getting up in arms and reacting against things is, it plays better. They get more voice. But I do think things, I like to believe things are improving. I'm just thinking of examples in my head of where it was not so good in the past and now it's better. But yeah.
So I appreciate your comments. And it makes me think, like, as you're talking about like conservative ideologies and more progressive leaning, I'm like, that right there is like political attitudes.
Right. Yeah.
Right? Like there seems to be some sort of correlation in terms of how people are approaching different things and how they're approaching gaming community. So obviously it's political. I appreciate that. So I want to kind of take us a little bit towards some recent news. So we'd be remiss if we didn't talk about the subreddit Wall Street Bets and the idea that the subreddit thread would be a potential attempt to democratize stock trading. Do you think that it was a coincidence that it was GameStop stock? That wasn't because I don't know GameStop, okay?
It's a tongue twister.
And I know this isn't your primary area, but I'm just really curious as to what your thoughts are on this.
So probably the best I can come up with as far as thoughts go is it wasn't coincidental, but it was also in a different way. the best way I could describe of why GameStop, because at the end of the day, it probably could have been anything, any like publicly traded company or whatever. As far as I've been able to tell from my own investigation looking into things, is the primary reason it was GameStop that was selected was because they thought it was funny. It was literally a meme. It wasn't, I mean, some of it was them seeing that GameStop stock, that is a little hard,
it is hard.
was perhaps a little undervalued. I think some of this was, if I'm right, some of this was generated with like COVID, because pre-COVID GameStop stock was probably pretty down because lo and behold that people don't want to get, a pittance for their used games and then go into some seedy store when they can just buy everything online. It's why Blockbuster went out of business, right? So the GameStop was trending downward, but with COVID sort of forcing everyone into their houses and in quarantine, etc., there's been a massive increase in the sales of video games and the video game industry in general. And to a certain extent, I believe GameStop has benefited from that. So this Wall Street Bets subreddit saw that to some extent, and then they just sort of all sort of jumped together on the GameStop bandwagon, and it just sort of took off from there. But I have seen and read that there are some people who would make the argument that part of it was there is a certain overlap of communities, right, between Redditors, I guess you could say, and people who play video games. So, and this might be wrong, but it's just something I've heard / seen a little bit of, is that if they were going to do this to a company, they would prefer to do one that they don't care for. And there's, I mean, it's a long running meme that gamers don't like GameStop, right? I say this having just bought stuff from GameStop. But it's a long running meme in that sense. And so, if this causes anything bad to happen to GameStop, I mean, it's kind of like whatever, because I don't think people are going to be that upset if GameStop just stops existing for whatever reason.
I mean, and Reddit isn't the only, kind of platform where I think gamers have, I don't know, maybe come together. Like, obviously, Twitch is a big place for gamers to come together, and in fact, AOC uses it frequently to communicate. I mean, not just with her constituents, but people in general. I mean, is there a kind of confluence of that politicians, especially maybe younger politicians, see that there are these new platforms that just so happen to be friendly for gamers as a new place to actually speak to people that could be turned into people that actually do care about politics, or at least care about changing things through a political mechanism?
Sure. I mean, I definitely think that there's possibility for that. Like, if you want to think of it as a form of potential political energy, I definitely think that it's there. To a certain degree, AOC's act of playing Among Us on Twitch with a bunch of other pretty big-time Twitch streamers is proof of concept, right? And I watched the whole thing because I'm frequently watching Twitch, and some of my favorite streamers were also playing with her. And I think the fact that she sort of built it as a only slightly get out the vote sort of event was probably the way to do it. If we're just looking at it from sort of a mechanics way of increasing voter turnout and voter enthusiasm, etc. But I think it's definitely difficult to do, and part of that is the whole, people who play video games, at least to a certain extent, they don't want politics in their video games. But another kind of point of it is, if you, I guess, try too hard, it just comes off as inauthentic, right? I'd be remiss if I didn't bring up the whole Pokemon Go to the polls, I would say, fiasco of Hillary Clinton. Her supporters might have liked it in that it was some type of stadium, I think, but that's just kind of cringy. Like, she even admitted herself that she doesn't know what Pokemon Go is. And so, I mean, she just comes off as this uninformed kind of individual who's just trying to score political points. And if there's anything that probably turns off young people to engaging in the political process, it's politicians being cringy and boring. But I think AOC did it differently and did it arguably more successfully because she was actually playing the game. She was actually having fun, engaging with streamers, talking with them, having these discussions and feuds and whatnot forming. There were highlightable moments within that context. So if politicians and activists want to utilize gaming as a platform for increasing these political activism, we'll say, they would need to go about it the right way. They need to lean more towards AOC, less towards Pokemon Go to the polls, right? And that's not easy to do because in a lot of cases, these politicians don't want to play these games, or they don't know how to play these games. They don't know what games to pick because video games are a constantly revolving door of what's, the thing to play on Twitch. Right now, Grand Theft Auto 5 is kind of making a bit of a comeback across Twitch, even though that game's old as dirt at this point. But they're playing it in arguably kind of a political way, even because there's this thing. It's called No Pixel. You probably don't know what I'm talking about. So just real quick, but it's essentially this mod for Grand Theft Auto 5, and I'm assuming you kind of have the gist of Grand Theft Auto 5 a little bit. But the Grand Theft Auto-ness of the game is sort of put to the side, and it's all this additional technology that's thrown in the game because modding video games and changing them in different ways is a huge thing within the video game community. And it basically allows individuals, mainly streamers, to insert themselves within this game world, and they talk within the game world and interact with it, and most of them come up with sort of personas for themselves. So it's role-playing or RP. It's not so much them playing Grand Theft Auto 5, it's them creating a character and interacting with other people, right? And that sounds kind of weird and boring, but it's the kind of thing that you just, you get it or you don't, and that's the kind of thing that's going to be really hard for politicians to get because they're just they kind of need to be ingratiated within the community and with how and why it's being successful, rather than just slapping a sticker on their campaign that it's like, oh, hey, I think video games are cool.
So I just want to mention that we have a comment in the chat on Twitch that says, I've met with and played with many people in different countries before in online gaming. It really can bring diverse groups of people together. So, and I think it was particularly salient to our last comment. I just wanted to make sure that y'all heard it and saw it.
I actually kind of have a point on that, if you don't mind.
Absolutely.
So, I do think that that's absolutely true. The ability of people to experience diversity, especially like global diversity within the context of video games, is there. That's absolutely a thing that happens. However, the point I would make and the point I would stress is that not all games are created equal on that front, right? So you have some games where you can play with people from wildly different backgrounds than you, with wildly different cultures and even languages, and still effectively play with them and experience them, and to have that sense of human connection. And it can be definitely a force for good. But not all games have you play with other people like that. Not all games have you knowing who the other player is in that same way. this is something I'm trying to like look at more specifically within my own research, is that some games, they almost go out of their way to otherize the people that you're playing against because it's good for like competition. For instance, you look at games like, just as a random example, like League of Legends, for instance, very popular, widely played game. When you're playing with people in a game like that, you're often just playing with your friends or people that you at least know or have natural access to in some ways. So usually people within your area or people that aren't outside of your own demographic. And the people you're playing against, you're not really hearing them talk. They're not able to express themselves in any way other than firing back at you. So the ability and the pressure, I would even say, in some of these games within some of these communities is to otherize the people you're playing against. And I think, and this is kind of pessimistic, that there are some games, because of their very design, can create sort of this contentious nature with other groups, right? Because you're kind of in your own microcosm, kind of like an echo chamber, if you will, where you're just playing with people you know, and the people you're playing against could be anybody. So you have instances of like toxicity in these games that are just very prevalent. I mean, anyone who's played these games, they know what I'm talking about. The amount of profanity and disparaging of different groups in some of these games is just huge. It makes it tough to play some of these games a lot of times, especially for individuals that find themselves as parts of those groups. I think that's part of why it's very hard for women to participate in a lot of online games, even though they very much want to. Because they don't want to be shouted at when they're playing and disparaged while they're playing, because who would want that? So when you have games like that, it's tough for those people to play, so then they don't play. So then it just kind of further continues the existence of these games as actually being fortresses, if you will, for these individuals to just sort of hear their friends. They hear the disparaging comments of their friends. They just keep hearing those comments. They start making them themselves, and they aren't exposed to the other cultures and ways of being and that diversity. So I think it's very dependent, in my opinion, it's part of what I'm looking at, of how these games are played is very important on that front.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like design matters, which I fully can believe is true. But I'm also wondering, and maybe this is a chicken and egg question, I don't know. But so I'm thinking of, you mentioned RPGs, and I think of also JRPGs. But I would also think that in many ways, playing video games, again, I'll throw back to Persona 5, where you're in Shibuya Station, walking around, like getting to know some parts of Japan and maybe some cultural differences between Americans and Japanese, although obviously they don't have cats that tell them to go to bed. But that's something that you wouldn't. There are maybe some things that you could learn that you wouldn't without being able to travel there. And we know that travel broadens our understanding of things. But another game is like Cyberpunk 2077, where you can actually, right? I mean, but in any game, you can choose your gender, right? You can choose your sexual or gender identity. You can choose your sexual organs. And maybe those don't match what you have, but maybe it gives you a sense of an experience that you couldn't get otherwise. I mean, is it that these games are changing the folks that play them, or is it that the games are changing because the folks that play them are different?
I mean, it's definitely kind of I'll admit chicken egg. It's probably, there is both going on. I would argue. You mentioned so it's kind of two different things that you brought up, right? It's getting to experience these things and being allowed to express yourself in those ways. Getting to experience things, yeah, sure. I think that's probably up there of just getting to experience different locales. I would say the example or the thing that I would probably lend myself more towards that I think might end up being more impactful on that front is getting to see representation rather than just locales. Just for instance, the existence of LGBTQ individuals within games has just skyrocketed in recent years, within probably the last 10 years. Because it didn't used to be that way. It used to be where there's even instances. There's this like recent one, for instance, where there's this one series that I very much enjoy. It's called Mass Effect, and there's this I think it was a report or an interview or something came out where in the development of the second game, Mass Effect 2, there was this character. Her name was Jack, and she was supposed to be like a clearly LGBT individual. She was supposed to be romanceable by both male and female players. But there was a backlash against that. They specifically cited like Fox News and some of their supporters being like having this contention about that. And ultimately the producers of the games stripped it. Like they made the call, and instead she was portrayed as being overtly straight, as opposed to I believe they said that she was like bisexual or pansexual within that context. But nowadays you have a plethora of options and individuals and diversity within countless games that show in a very human and sympathetic way members of the LGBTQ community, African Americans, people from other cultures, people of different languages and backgrounds, just the whole gambit, if you will. And some games do this a little bit more offhandedly, and some just straight up go for it. I think there's probably purpose and point to both of those. And I think, I don't know, in my own personal opinion, it's a little tough. I'd like to see games do better, and just continue to do better, because you bring up like Cyberpunk 2077, which I played. I mean, I beat it myself, so like I experienced the story of it. But there was backlash from sort of the progressive side against CD Projekt Red when they were in development of this game. There was like two things that came out. There was some instances, I believe, where there was accusations of some transphobia within the company, and probably a little bit more prevalent. Maybe that's not the best word, but the other thing that came out of it was the way, and I played the game so I can contest that this is how it works, the way in which your character's gender is sort of selected it's more based off of like the tone of voice that you select. So you either choose the masculine tone of voice or the feminine tone of voice, as they describe it, and that dictates, and they straight up tell you that this will dictate the pronouns that people use for you. And members of the transgender community and others were pointing out that, like, hey, why don't you just let them pick their pronouns and also let them pick their tone of voice? Because they do the other things really well. Cyberpunk is definitely, I mean, you have to admit, on the forefront of allowing individuals to select whatever genitalia they want.
Although I point out there were multiple choices for penises and really only one choice for vulva.
Yes, that was true. Yes, that is a fair point.
Not all vulvas are created equal. Just live Twitch world.
Sure. So yeah, there. But to a certain extent, there are some people who would come back at that, because the far bigger, at the end of the day, controversy for Cyberpunk 2077 was the fact that it was released way before it should have been.
Way too early.
Yeah, that game was a mess. I enjoyed myself. There were some good bits of it. There were some good stories. Some very human, I would say, political things. Something I don't think gets enough attention, honestly, is the game has multiple endings, right? Mm-hmm. And one of the endings that you can select, just anyone can select it when the time comes, is there is what would be described as a suicide ending within that game, where you can actively choose this. It's sort of a no-win situation. I won't do spoilers. Sorry if that's a spoiler for Cyberpunk, I guess. But you can essentially have your character just say, screw it, and just peace out in a very dramatic fashion. That's actually the ending I selected my first time through, because I don't know, I just kind of for weird reasons, I guess, with how I was like interacting with the game at that point because I was a little disjected, but whatever. But the end credits of the game, right? They have this instance and they do this thing where in the end credits for any ending, you see the characters that you've come to, know and love throughout the game. Whatever ending you choose, they sort of give you highlights and they're like talking to you, because within the world of this game, the way that people do mourning and funerals is they kind of send videos to like a person's like grave, if you will, right? So if you select this ending, you have all these instances of these characters being like, why did you do this? I'm so angry. And it's very powerful in that way. Like the voice acting work for this ending just tears your heartstrings. And there's just these lines like, this one character's like, I don't think you knew how many friends you had, and stuff like that. And I'm just watching this, I'm just like, feeling it. And I mean, I don't think stuff like that got this very kind of real, I would say, portrayal of this horrible situation, and sort of promoting that like, hey, this is not an option. You should always, work to not do that. So, and I would say that in some ways that is a very political thing for them to do.
Yeah, I mean, even in Hellblade, and I think Hellblade, well, they must in Hellblade too, right? They take on mental health as a very central issue in the game, and I find it fascinating. I don't. Again, you're right. You probably is both chicken and egg. I don't know what the root of it is, but I think it is indicative that maybe there's a broadening of minds there. So, any other Twitch comments, Ashley?
Yeah, so I just had one more that said, as someone who has played Cyberpunk, I really appreciate that and agree with what has been said. So acknowledgement that thinking about the ending and thinking about mental health is my interpretation of that comment. So yeah. So I don't have any other questions. I put it out there, asked if they had any questions for you. I haven't gotten any yet. But this is how we always end our podcast, which is, do you have any final comments, any words of wisdom for our listeners? And I'm going to put in a tiny little asterisk, because at the very beginning, people on Twitch didn't get a chance to hear you say what it is that you study. And I think it came out in our conversation, but if you want to do final words of wisdom and a little asterisk that says, I study this, and this is what I study, that would be super awesome.
Sure. I could just start with what I'm studying, which is the effects that playing video games and the video game community can have on the personal political attitudes and political behaviors of individuals. And I would do a little asterisk of my own and saying I'm kind of doing a bit of a broad net as far as what those effects necessarily are and how they might come about. As far as last words of wisdom,
everybody struggles with this.
Yeah. I mean, I might make the argument that people, especially people who are not young, could definitely find some video games that they would enjoy, and I would say they should go for those things. And there are, you know what? No, I'm gonna switch what mine was. So I talked earlier about how I think it's very I think it's a very human thing to enjoy video games, and I think that's sort of obvious if you look at sort of the two main reasons why people play video games. And the first one being sort of this idea of camaraderie, companionship, and competition, where you want to interact with people. Social interaction is a very human thing. And I think especially in COVID times, we could probably all use a little more social interaction. Video games are a great way to do that. Personally, I've been trying to play more video games with my friends, and it makes for a good quality time to get to do something together, because we can't do things in person as much as we would like to. And the other thing I would say is I'm a firm believer in the fact that I think that there is a certain human quality to what I would say the call to adventure within everyone. I think it's a very human thing. And I think in today's day and age, the ability to experience that, to go out and to seek and to explore one's world is non-existent, especially for individuals of lower socioeconomic status or even moderate socioeconomic status. And especially in COVID times, you can't go to Hawaii and feel that satisfaction of experiencing the world, right? Not only that, but you just might not have the money to do that. And that for me is part of what I enjoy so much about video games, is because there's something inside me that just wants to explore and adventure and discover the unknown. And that is to a T what video games, especially certain ones, are seeking to do. You look at video games like The Legend of Zelda, for instance, is a great example. So I guess my suggestion or piece of wisdom would be everyone should try to, as best they can, play a game like Breath of the Wild. That is a fantastic game. Great. If you've never played a video game, I would say even still give it a shot, because it's beautiful and you'll get to experience that sense of wonder and adventure that I don't think people necessarily get enough in their normal everyday lives.
I have a quick question from
Sure.
from someone in the chat that says, do you have a Twitch or anything else that they can follow? Because people are interested in hearing more from you.
I do have a Twitch. I'll admit I would love to do like some streaming or something. Part of me, I tried it once, but like only my friends kind of came in and watched me. But I think I have the voice and the attitude for it, maybe a little bit, but I don't know. Maybe I'm a little too shy for that.
Maybe now's the time to start. Come on.
Yeah, maybe now's the time. I do have a great new mic now, so that's one step in the right direction, right? I do have a Twitch.
He's reluctant. He's like, I do.
I'm reluctant.
Share it.
So I'm reluctant to say, because, and this is sort of a part of gamer culture for people who might not be aware, and this is actually a pretty big thing about gamer culture, I wish I brought this up earlier, is the existence of like gamer tags, right? Which is just how people know you online. And most of the time people will just have one, they'll stick with it, and they'll use it for every game and every system and device, right? I've changed mine over the years. My current one is Fancy Pangolin. So they can probably find me by searching that on Twitch. I can't guarantee I'm going to start streaming anytime soon, but if they see me in a chat or something, I am Fancy Pangolin. I could explain to you why it's Fancy Pangolin, but it's a very boring story. Actually, it's not boring. It's just a very weird story. But I don't know, maybe someone can ask me that independently, because it's a story. I don't want to take up too much time.
Any other comments?
Yeah, this person said, I've nodded along with almost everything that has been said and really appreciate this stream. Question for Dan: does he have a favorite game?
Ooh, favorite game? Yes. My go-to, obviously, it's like
Animal Crossing.
It's not. I am a big fan of Animal Crossing. Animal Crossing is a great game. It's also a game I totally think, if you're looking for an entry point into playing video games, Animal Crossing, great one. My mother has actually been playing some Animal Crossing, and I think she's enjoying it, so that's nice. So big fan of Animal Crossing. It is not my favorite game. My go-to for favorite game of all time is probably a game called Bioshock Infinite, which is a sequel-ish to the original Bioshock 1 and 2. It's just a fantastic game. It's beautiful. You're playing in a city in the clouds, and to the point of the podcast, it is a very political game. The essence of the game is you sort of fighting back, but also not fighting back against this sort of totalitarian religious organization that is literally seeking to bathe the world in fire, and it just sends you on this trip across time and space trying to rescue, I don't know, it's kind of an old game, so I don't know if I should give spoilers or not. Rescue a young woman. I'll just leave it at that. But there's a lot of just beautiful moments in the game, and they do this real like question and tease of like what is free will and what does it like mean to like own your own destiny, and it's just a fantastic game from beginning to end. So that's probably my go-to of favorite game. Whether or not it is, I'm not exactly sure. I'd have to think about it. I've been enjoying some recent stuff.
Well, people are liking your comments in the chat. So yes, Bioshock. I was going to ask for an opinion of Bioshock, especially because it's political. The entire series is great. So I mean, people are, just so you know, people are interacting with us, so they're watching it.
To that end, I would say I have not played Bioshock 1 or 2. They're on my bucket video game list, but so are just a million other things. I'm finally getting around to one that my friend, hi Caleb, if you're watching, he's a big fan. It's called Fire Emblem Three Houses.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So I'm finally getting around to playing that because it's probably been a year since he started playing. He's been wanting me to play it the whole time. It is a great game, and I have been enjoying it. I'm like just on the final battle, so
what are your thoughts about why backlash against Last of Us 2? I mean, not only for the fact that there was a gay couple that was central in the story, but also because one of the main characters was, I mean, ostensibly gender I won't say non-binary, but didn't fit a typical gender stereotype in that she identified as female, but definitely wasn't projecting herself as typical female. And yet, I mean, there was some initial backlash, and that seemed to quiet down.
Yeah. Personally, I have not played The Last of Us Part 2 or The Last of Us Part 1. Or just The Last of Us. The only reason for that, literally the only reason, is I've never owned a PlayStation, and those are games that just happen to be more on PlayStation.
Now's a bad time to get a PlayStation 5, I gotta tell you.
I've always been more of a person to play PC games, Xbox, and Nintendo just throughout my life. Nothing wrong. I have nothing against PlayStation. I'm not one for the console wars that exist. I think people should just play whatever they have and whatever they can get access to. So I haven't played it, so I can't talk too specifically on it. That being said, I do understand what you're talking about, and I think it kind of comes from two places. The one place that I have seen a lot of is those reactionary conservative parts of the gaming community that I was referencing earlier. In my experience, from what I've seen, they tend to do this thing where they try to come up with more reasons to hate on something than they innately have. So for a lot of them, they can't just be like, I don't like The Last of Us Part 2 because it gives too much attention to LGBT people. They can't just do that in this day and age because people kind of knock them down. So they kind of pivot, right? So they do this thing, for instance, where one of the things that happened with The Last of Us Part 2 is it got really good game reviews. One of the websites Sure, right, exactly. One of the websites that I frequent for gaming news is IGN, right? And this is just as an example of kind of what I'm talking about. IGN gave it, I believe, like a perfect score, like a 10 out of 10. They were like, this is a masterpiece of a game. You should absolutely play it. And conservative individuals, maybe not even just conservative, but these reactionary individuals took that as proof that the game industry is rigged, right? That these games aren't that good, and maybe The Last of Us Part 2 wasn't a 10 out of 10 game. Who cares? It's a great game. You should play it. You shouldn't base your opinion off of one website saying that it was a perfect game. That's nonsense if you do that. By all means, I've absolutely disagreed with some of IGN's opinions of other games. That's just having an opinion. But they latch on to that and they use it. So when I'm looking at IGN articles, you'll often see comments that are literally the post has nothing to do with The Last of Us Part 2. It'll be talking about something completely wildly different or a different game that they're reviewing or something. And you'll see comments by these people. And it's just Last of Us 2, 10 out of 10. Again and again and again. And the reason they're posting that is because they're trying to make fun of IGN for giving this game a good score. Because they're mad at the game. Because at the end of the day, why do they really care that IGN gave them a 10 out of 10? They're a random website that these people probably don't care about. They obviously want to make fun of IGN, so why do they care that IGN gave them a 10 out of 10, and they just see it as indicative of this like liberalization of the video game industry, and like, oh, you only gave it a 10 out of 10 because you want to support those games. And I think that's kind of nonsense. And so they have those reactions to things, but I believe maybe someone can give it a little more nuance. I've yet to see anyone able to effectively describe it in more nuance. That they look for excuses to bash or disparage games that they disagree with, just because they want to bash and disparage games that they disagree with, because they have their own points of views and their own agendas that they're trying to put forward into the world.
I find it really interesting to look how these different gaming companies respond to external pressure, or maybe even don't even get it. So I'm thinking of Steam, where Valve decided to take off a game because it included a school shooting, even though forever they said, listen, it's like, free speech. That's how we see it. This is our policy. We're not going to take stuff down. And then they did finally decide to take it down, but then got, even more blowback. And yet you have a company like Humble Bundle, for instance, where if you subscribe to it every month, you get all these free games, right? And yet they're taking profits and giving it to charity. And it may be charities that you don't align with, and yet maybe you don't even check that out. And I've never heard anybody say anything bad about Humble Bundle. And so I'm just curious, why these kind of different responses? Is it just because of these kind of pinpoint events? Or is there something else in gamer culture that I'm not understanding?
I mean, I think to a certain degree, I mean, it's harder to have a backlash against something when it's more widely accepted, right? So you are right. There probably are absolutely charities that have received money from Humble Bundles that maybe aren't perfect charities. That's probably just bound to happen because Humble Bundle tends to change the charities. My quick addendum to that is people can also just select how much money goes to charity. So if they don't agree with a charity, they can just be like, no, none to those people. I mean, I think I might have even done that once or twice when I've bought a few Humble Bundles myself. I barely play any of the games I've gotten from them, but whatever, it's charity, so it's fine. But no, they do good work. So I think it's harder to combat it when it's something like that. But if you have these instances where it's easy to get upset at something because it's sort of popular or it's making news for other reasons, then it's easy to jump down the throat of those instances. One kind of example that has happened very recently is there is this game that is being revived now. This has been making the rounds a little bit news-wise. It's called 6 Days in Fallujah. And it is a game that is purposefully and actively marketing itself as a game where you are, I believe, U.S. Marines during the invasion of Fallujah. And so with that, when this game first came about, I think the first times it was being worked on was back in 2012. Backlash to that, because the war was kind of not that old, and so people had this reaction. It was just like, this just happened, and you're already making a game out of it. Like, this is too soon. You need to calm down. But now it's being revived, and what's happening is, at least I've seen, is the conservative side of gaming community is really, building themselves up around this game, right? They're seeing this game as like, oh, the SJWs are losing. This game's getting made. Like, yes, like finally an honest Marine combat game where I can shoot up Middle Eastern people. Yeah! Don't take that out of context, please. I'm doing a caricature. So they're excited about this game, but most of the reason I would argue that they're excited about this game is because they think that it's making SJW liberal snowflakes mad. But I might hold my breath a little bit on that. And this is a comment I have made, is that I would put my money on the chances that if a game like that is being made in today's era, it's probably not going to be quite as pro-American and like, yes, army good, other people bad, as some of these people might be hoping for. It might actually have a little bit more nuance than that. Part of the reason I think that is if you look even at some games, my big example for this is this game came out recently, Call of Duty Cold War. Not that people play Call of Duty games for the story missions, but if you play the story missions of Call of Duty Cold War, and there's, a decent amount of them, the game is pretty actively critical of the United States in a lot of ways. For instance, one of the endings, also, I know this is spoilers, but no one plays Call of Duty games for the story, so I just don't care. One of the endings literally has your person, who is supposed to be this like CIA government agent, sleeper, soldier kind of person. I didn't play it, I just watched it played. So sorry if I get a couple minor details wrong, but it basically comes out that the US government has been effectively brainwashing you. And this one ending has your supervisor just literally killing you just out of nowhere because you're a loose end. And that is a staunch and hard look at the way that the US government is looking at its soldiers and looking at war and how we do war. And it's kind of critical. And on the other hand, it also straight up allows you to side with the Russians in the Cold War. And I mean, they're painted as kind of a little bit caricature evil-y, but it's not as like, there are signs of it being sort of like, oh, we're doing what we think is right at the very least. They're not painting these Russian individuals as just these overtly bad monsters that should be destroyed, right? So I think that's something that people might be surprised to hear because no one plays Call of Duty, at least the storylines of it anyways. So you see that. And like I said, of these games sort of evolving in their content and the way that they react to politics and put politics in their games, it is constantly changing, and it is constantly, I would say, getting a little bit more progressive on average as time goes on. Obviously, there's also some games that are just wildly progressive in a lot of ways. My favorite one of that would probably be Undertale, which is a wildly progressive game if you ever play it. Also, great game, super easy, super fun, great story, also very cheap. Another game recommendation is I think everyone should play Undertale because it's a very fun game.
That's awesome. Dan, I want to say thank you so much for joining us. I've learned a ton. It's probably pretty obvious from the conversation that Casey is the one who was leading this. But it was nice because then I could be looking at what everything else was going on. But thank you for being our guinea pig in many ways for our first live stream podcast episode. It was really a pleasure having you on. Thank you so much.
Yep. Pleasure to be here.
Thanks for listening, everyone, and watching for those of you joining us on our live stream, the Growing Democracy podcast. I'm Casey Boyd-Swan, and as always, the lovely Ashley Nichols. Our podcast is produced by David Ursa and edited by Jeremy Demery at Golden Ox Studio right here in Cleveland, Ohio. And also, big thank you to Ben and Emily. Thank you so much for suggesting this. Next time, you guys will have to come on here. We are also supported by the American Political Science Association. If you like our show and you want to know more, check out our website, growingdemocracyoh.org, and join us next time when we talk more about political and civic engagement.